Welcome to ByteWise, the podcast where technology meets risk management. And now, introducing the hosts, Daniela Parker, with a background in risk management and a passion for making risk-aware decisions. Next, Glenn Sorensen, a veteran in cybersecurity and supporting while protecting. And last but not least, Brian Talon, the technology whiz who's a master of collaboration. Ever wondered how blockchain's potential weighs against its pitfalls? Or how AI's advancements align with ethical considerations? Whether listeners are tech aficionados looking to view challenges through a risk lens or risk professionals seeking clarity in the digital maze, ByteWise has them covered. Dive in as the trio decodes, discusses, and demystifies the intertwined realms of technology and risk. Tune into ByteWise, where technology and risk converge with clarity and insight.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of ByteWise. Glenn, Brian, and I are back again. And as promised last time, we are going to talk today a little bit about how we talk to people in our organizations about what our areas do and how we get some buy-in. Brian and Glenn, how are we doing today?
Great, thanks.
Doing terrific.
All right. So I think one of the topics that comes up quite often in the risk space, in the InfoSec space, and in IT is about the fact that I think we often feel misunderstood. So I can tell you from the risk management side of the house, a lot of times people think that when risk enters the room, I'm all of a sudden the decision maker. The flip side of that is that, maybe they think I have absolutely no input in anything. But I feel a lot of times having to create buy-in in the organization is a really big topic for people that are in our professions. And again, for me in the risk space, it's oftentimes about people just not even understanding what exactly do I do? How am I different from audit? And then who let me in anyways? How about the two of you? I know we all share some of these experiences, but I literally sometimes feel like, why is she here? It's just in the room.
Yeah, I get that too. There's in cybersecurity land a little bit, there's the, perception of, it's defense against the dark arts, right? So it's that black magic that we don't really understand. And, IT is a little bit of that black magic anyway, but the security stuff is like super black magic. And, from my perspective, we need to work hard at demystifying that a little bit and putting it in terms that are understandable to other people in the business and to executive leadership. So for us, I think that's a communications challenge.
Brian, when you enter the room, I'm just like, we're just going to let the IT guy talk because they ultimately just know everything anyways. And we touched on this last time. So how does that feel from your perspective?
It feels like it's a lot of weight on one person's shoulders, to be honest. Everybody in that room should be understanding what's going on, whether it's a deep understanding or whether it's at least a on the surface understanding. Everyone needs to understand because those decisions need to be made. And I think there's a misconception out there that all of this risk is a technology decision. So if there's some risk somewhere, that's a technology problem, and it's not. It's a business problem. And I think everyone needs to understand that.
I can relate to that. There are so many times where I feel like I get a little bit of a deer in the headlights look when I start talking about some of this stuff, and that, hey, I need a decision from you. Like what level of risk are you willing to accept here? Because we've got maybe a high, medium, a low risk path to all of this, and they all have different costs associated with them, different levels of effort. I need to have some direction from the business on what way to go. So.
Yeah, and then usually that's when all eyes come my way. They're like, okay, now you in risk, you make the decision. So So part of that challenge is, when you're trying to create the buy-in, right? And like, I understand my role, at least I think I understand my role, but how do I even get support for what I'm doing, right? Back to the whole, like, why is she even here? And I know that my fellow colleagues in the audit space experience that as well, right? And that's part of sometimes where we connect, is in the whole, nobody wants us in the room. And I remember, and I think I shared that in the first episode, that I worked in an environment where risk management was referred to as the internal affairs, and people were told not to talk to us, right? And so the challenge is always, how do you get people to, what's a good way to actually explain what we do? Because it depends on who you're talking to, right? You talk to a board member versus senior management versus employees in general, how you present it makes a difference. And then, like, how do you get the buy-in for what you're trying to do? So I'll start with you, Brian. I mean, again, everybody thinks they know what IT does, but do they really? And then how do you communicate that and get support for what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, the support really is, again, back to the risk conversation, right? I find that I've as long as I'm comfortable talking about the risk itself, and then I turn that back into that question that I asked, or that comment I made a few minutes ago, that risk itself is a business problem. And when I talk about these things, when we're talking about the risk of anything, or the dangers that something, doing something or not doing something poses, I get a whole different look when I turn that around and I force that, frankly, to become a business problem. It's really a financial discussion, right? It's a financial decision.
Mm-hmm.
In IT, I mean, frankly, we can do pretty much anything with enough time and money, and usually more money. So your risk is it boils down to a financial decision, which, frankly, IT isn't qualified to make. So that's why we look to the business. And when that concept gets through to them, I find a different look coming, because then all of a sudden they realize that they're actually responsible for these decisions. And if something goes south, it's not just one of those IT decisions, and IT didn't do it right, so that's why we have a problem. And it's more, we identified the problem, we identified the solutions, we've made a financial decision not to. Then the responsibility, it really becomes part of the business where it should be to begin with.
I have found that a lot of times IT ends up being the decision maker in an organization, because there's this like circle of events that happen, right? So like, people come to a meeting and it's a technology related thing. And frankly, Brian, you're one of the few people I know that actually look at it from your perspective. A lot of times,
Right.
Technology folks are very much in the habit of saying, okay, I understand this the best, and so I'm just going to make the decision. And what we see a lot is that everybody else in the room goes, well, they're the tech folks. Like, I'm not going to argue with them. And so IT then ends up making the decisions. And somehow it shapes this culture of, we're just going to go have IT make all the technology decisions. And I literally had a college professor spend an hour and a half in a lecture talking about why IT should never make business decisions. And it kind of stuck with me. But again, in practice, I often see that the technology folks don't necessarily want to make the decisions, but they're also the ones that are expected to deliver on a project. And then when nobody else wants to make the decision, your project gets delayed. You're just trying to get your work done. And so you just make the decision and move. Is that
Right.
a fair observation?
It is. And to be honest with you, that allowing the culture where IT makes those decisions is in itself a decision, right? That in itself is a financial decision. I've always thought, if you want me to make all the decisions, that's fine. I'll make every decision, but at the end of the day, the reason I'm making the decision is because someone else refused to, and we needed to move forward with something. which to me then again is back to a business and financial decision. It's no different
kind of
than
its own dysfunction, maybe there that
it is.
That exists in the organization's culture, right? So
Yeah, and it makes it hard to create buy-in into something you're trying to do when the organization as a whole doesn't even really fully understand like what it is that you're doing, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, how do we? What do you use to educate folks? Like, it's one thing to say, here's an article, or for me, right? Like I can hand people the ERM, I can hand them the COSO framework and say, this is what ERM is, or I hand them a framework. The same for both of you. There's frameworks for us, right? We hand them a framework and we're like, well, this is what we do. But is it? And then people aren't going to A, read it, and B, it's challenging, right? And do people really want to listen and understand what your role is, considering how packed everybody's day is? So any best, I don't like the word best practices, but any tips on how do you even do that? How do you even start with an organization?
I think there's some education that has to happen, but there's also there's got to be some willingness to be open to, and this is for like from the business perspective, to be open to listening and understanding a little bit more about what we have to say. And I think historically there's been a lot of again that it's black magic, defense against the dark arts stuff that like we don't understand it as business people, so we're just going to let those IT and security and risk people make those decisions for us. What I think the path forward is a little bit better education, a little bit of communication, but then expecting a little bit of that in return. So I think this is very much a holistic problem and an organizational culture problem.
Where do you start? You start at the top, you start at the bottom. Where do you start?
I have started both places.
Okay.
And I can give some examples of that. In an organization I worked in before, I found myself in a role where the manager that I reported to did not really want to understand what was going on or do anything differently in the organization. I kind of was there because there was an audit checkbox that needed to be filled. And I pretty quickly recognized that, okay, I was not going to make forward progress with management in this path. So I immediately went about spreading it at a grassroots level, working with IT, helping them understand what I do and what I need, and what the organization needed from a security and risk standpoint there. And that had some effect. And I mean, I think to this day, some of the folks that I worked with there would say that the efforts I put forth did spread that culture. And I think that's important. The flip side of that is, working with you guys was a good example. But there was, management willing to understand to some degree what was needed, what was going on, what some of the problems were, and willing to listen. And when you have both of those, you can really start to make some progress.
Brian, again, everybody always thinks that, we all know what IT does, but how do you go about it? Especially considering your rather unique perspective on it.
I think you really have to know the organization and the organization's culture and frankly, know your audience. I've been in situations many times where I could go into a room and I could talk about certain concepts, and I knew that maybe not everybody was going to understand 100% of them, but they'd at least have reasonable questions or at least ask for clarification on things. I worked for one company where on my second day there, the CEO walked into my office and said, "As long as nobody's complaining about IT, I don't even want to talk to you. Just take care of everything."
That's right? Sad.
And that was his way of running his business. He as the owner, he really didn't want to be involved in anything IT as long as nobody was complaining. And so again, that back to a business decision for him. As the owner of the company, it was a business decision to turn all those things over to me. And then you can't work with somebody at the top. Then you have to start socializing it at some different level.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think another way to put it is, you plant seeds and you water them a little bit over time, and some of them at least grow into something, and it does make a difference.
I like that analogy always a lot. Like you plant seeds, right? Because ultimately, a lot of times we're in the risk space. I feel like we're not necessarily on everybody's mind first, right? Even though I believe we bring a huge amount of value, that doesn't mean that every time someone does a project, the first thing they think about is to call me. And trust me, they don't. Based on experience. So it's the planting the seed, right? And for me, when we started building out a risk management program, one of the biggest things was like little wins, right? You just have small wins that kind of show the organization what you're bringing to the table, how you're making things better. And the first area that I started working on was really business continuity, which again in itself is a grossly misunderstood discipline where everybody just thought I was going to revamp the evacuation process and maybe do a fire drill, right? So when we started with that one of the side effects was the process improvement piece, because when you look at your business impact analysis and you look at processes and you're trying to create a backup process, and the existing process is so complicated that you're like, well, we're not going to have a downtime process for this because it's way too complicated as is, then you can provide input, right? You can tell the organization, did you know that 2 other people are doing what you're doing in this organization, right? So there was a lot of that. That was just showing how that big picture approach that risk brings to the table can help with efficiencies and just seeing where the blind spots are. So it's those things that created the buy-in. And then I remember one of the highlights of standing up a risk program was really when I got a call from an employee, and she said, I have to make a decision on this product. Would you do a risk assessment for me? And I thought, okay, the day has come, right?
Light
Like
bulb.
Finally someone's calling me for help. And so that was, I think, the approach, like planting the seed, right? Inserting wherever you can. I know I generally say, I just try to come to everyone's meeting and just introduce myself, say what I do, what I don't do, answer questions, and try to talk as much as I can about what I do until the organization kind of understands it. And I feel like it's like a toddler sleep schedule. Like we make progress and then we regret. But what's regression is what it's called,
Yeah,
right?
we have
Yeah, the
regression.
sleep
Yeah.
regression. Yeah. So I feel like that's kind of how it always goes. We make progress and then something happens and you're like, wow, did anybody listen the last 2 years? So that's always been my experience. Let's talk about maybe from a board perspective, right? When I started with the risk piece, we started at the board level. And that was a good thing because the board ultimately has risk oversight. But the board also is really on the strategic level. It's about setting appetite, the risk appetite for the organization. And it's becoming more and more challenging, though, with regulation changing in the financial services industry. There's more and more requirements from the regulators as to what information has to be taken to the board. And then the board is actually expected to challenge it, right? So that is it. There's a little bit of a blurry line there. But any of you want to share some experiences dealing with the board level in the organization?
Yeah, I think maybe what comes to mind first for me is boiling it down to a couple of the key areas of risk, especially in cyber risk land, in a way that's understandable and like using common terms. And I think it also helps to be able to put numbers to some of your risks in some cases, and say that these are the top few risks that we're facing and that we're addressing, and a plan to address them. And in hopes that you get questions, and I've found that, as I'm sure you're well aware, you don't always get the questions that you hope you do, but you do the best you can.
Well, and it's because people are, it's a complicated subject. I mean, you know how I operate. I always need pictures, and I still have these visual images in my head when we talk about the core. I literally still see the Star Trek like Enterprise core in front of me, right? But those are concepts that are hard to understand.
Core.
The core, yes,
Yeah.
the warp core. That's what I see every time we talk about core. But that's it. Those are complicated processes, right? And so I think people just don't know how to ask the right question or what question to even ask. Or they're like, well, Glenn's got this. He sounds pretty smart.
He sounds smart. Famous last words, right?
We trusted him. Brian.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think with boards especially if they're boards made up of people that are not in the, full-time in the industry that the organization's in, such as we have sometimes at credit unions or volunteer boards. So, having them ask the right questions is really a challenge because they don't know what questions they should be asking. And I think that leads to a little bit of fear on their part to ask a question to make it sound, so they don't want to sound dumb, of course, and they don't want to be, thought to be, they don't want anyone thinking less of them.
Yes.
So they don't know what question to ask, so they stay quiet. And the way you handle the first one of those with that board really dictates the rest of your future with that board.
Well, and I'll tell you what, for me, I often feel that the challenge is really on my side, right? Because if I present information in a way that makes people feel that for whatever reason they can't ask questions, I feel like I kind of failed on that end, right? Because then that means that I didn't present it in a way that got the point across as to why it is important that they have this information and what their role is. And that's kind of like where a lot of times I fall into that same thing with, technology, with just the words that we use or the concepts that we talk about that are so easy for me to understand, but not everybody understands it, nor do they really know why I'm talking to them right now, right? Like, why am I bringing a report on the state of our business continuity program? Why am I throwing all these weird acronyms out? I think that a lot of times there's ways to do it. And sometimes it's just about saying, this is really a regulatory requirement, and please ask me questions because the regulators want you to. There's like, what questions do we ask? Well, you have to challenge me. That's it. Literally on the business continuity side, the regulation says that there has to be a credible challenge by the board, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a chasm there that's a mile wide potentially.
Yeah.
And you got to cross that somehow. So I think one thing that comes to mind for me too is on the cyber risk front, there's a push from regulatory bodies to get cybersecurity expertise on a board of directors, and that's hard. It's hard to fill cybersecurity roles at large. So then to get somebody that's maybe qualified to sit on a board of directors somewhere is a small subset of even that. So what do we do? Well, I mean, we need more education at large about cybersecurity cybersecurity and risk management out in the culture, I guess, at large in businesses across all industries.
Yeah,
so.
I would agree. So let's talk a little bit about senior management. The senior management folks in the organization? What are we running into there with some of the obstacles?
Mostly,
Big sigh. That was a big sigh.
big sigh. I think mostly I end up with the, last week we talked a little bit about so what when it came to, audit findings and such. I run into a little bit of the now what. Okay, so now you told me all of this stuff. I may or may not understand it. Probably don't understand it really well, but I don't want to let on to that. Now what? Right? What do you need from me? What do you want me to do? And if that's not clear up front, then you have a problem, because frankly, I don't want someone who doesn't understand it very well to think that I want them to come up with a solution, right? If I'm doing my job well enough, I'm dictating what the decision that I'd like them to make is. If they want to make a different one, no problem, right? Again, it's a financial decision. You document it and you move on. And but if you show up with no recommendation, you end up with that question. Okay, now what? Right? And if you don't have an answer to that, you're going to find somebody's either going to abandon you, or they're going to try to solve your problem for you. And I don't like either one of those.
So is now what a step up from so what? Is that like a maturity model?
It is.
Maybe, yeah.
So we move from so what to now what. Yeah. But that's a good point, the recommendation piece, right? And from my perspective too, I always have a recommendation, because while my role is to assess the risk and present that information, I will always have a recommendation with it. Whether or not that's the final decision, that's somewhere else. But I do agree, right? Like the now what? Well, here's the recommendation from my side of the house, and you do need to be prepared for that. Otherwise, you do lose credibility pretty quickly, because it's like, okay, so I could probably figure all that out by myself. I need a little bit more. So that's a good point for the executive level.
Yeah, and kind of to tag on to that a little bit, the way that we approach cyber risk in my current role, which is more virtual CISO, but we identify, we do a couple of things through our CRMAP process, but the first part of that is really identifying the top 5 cyber risks, designing some mitigations that fit them and don't overwhelm any particular area at any given time, and put a roadmap together that implements those mitigations in that way that doesn't overload any one area, and over a period of time that's reasonable. And you can kind of measure that over a period of time. So we've got a basic 0 to 10 scoring system that we use for all the areas, and specifically around the NIST cybersecurity framework, but we can kind of plug in other frameworks as needed. But then you can use that as a scorecard and start to say, okay, well, we started here. Our target is, 5 or 8 or whatever it may be. And we work toward that in each of those areas. And over time, you can show, okay, well, we have gotten better in those areas. So
is that the roadmap that we used when we worked together?
That was kind of a precursor to
a version. What I loved about that roadmap was that it let you plug in your resources. So basically you outlined everything you had to do, and then it told you, like, considering that currently you have 1 part-time FTE in information security, you will get this roadmap done in 45 years.
Yes.
That was my favorite part about it, though, because it was very real. It was really not overestimated or underestimated. It made sense, right? Like the amount of time and what was involved, and it calculated in everything outside of that. I thought it was a super helpful tool. And sure enough, it did get a couple of additional FTEs approved, because the organization wasn't okay with it taking, 45 years. It wasn't 45, but it was a substantial amount of time.
Exactly. And it's, the way Kip, one of my many mentors in this, likes to describe that, and he's my boss currently, CEO of Cyber Risk Opportunities. There's unlimited risk, but there's finite resources to put towards mitigating those risks. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So I mean, are you okay with this taking 45 years, or maybe you're going to devote some more resources to it?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The 45
and
years.
you know, there's decisions that have to be made and trade-offs, and you know, maybe you want to hire more FTEs, and maybe you want to outsource some of it. Maybe you just want to not worry about some of it right now. Maybe we'll deal with that next year. I
Yeah.
mean, those are all, you know, reasonable business decisions to make in that. So
we are at time. We've committed to keeping this podcast at 30 minutes, but I feel like this topic, we could do a little follow-up episode on it, because I don't even know that we really dove all that deep into how we interact with the different stakeholders in the organization and get some buy-in. So we'll just continue this conversation next time. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we will, you will get to listen to us in the next episode.
all right, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on ByteWise today. As we wrap up, we're reminded of the ever-evolving world of technology and its intricate dance with risk. Whether you're diving deep into code or dissecting risk scenarios, remember to always bridge understanding with insight. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep tuning into ByteWise.